me, Nimsuni. Welcome back to another physics video. Today I'm messing around with some joints. So not the usual place that I mess around with physics stuff, but today is a specific demonstration for a specific thing, which is about fixed joints. I'm just going to run the game and we'll see what I'm looking at. So here I've got a very simple joint-based physics gun that just grabs things and moves them about. And you can see here two sets of two objects. The one on the left here, the blue object, is a very heavy object, while the one on the right is the red object, is a lot lighter. So it's actually 50 kg on the right and 4000 kg on the left, the blue boxes. Both sides, so both of these, this one and this one, are exactly the same, where they're sort of fixed jointed between two objects, the 4000 kg on the left and 50 kg on the right, and the same thing on this side here. Except you'll notice something a little bit different. So obviously here I can pick it up from the blue side or the red side and move it, and you can see it works quite nicely. You can tell it's a fixed joint. And here same thing again, except when I lift it on the red side. And the reason for that is obviously it's quite a standard problem of having jointed objects in a physics engine, in any game engine, or any physics engine that you can use in a game, where the light object, very light object here, because it's 50 kg as opposed to 4000, will always have this wobble whenever you lift it and it's sort of hooked onto something very heavy. And that's what I've sort of, tried to fix here. Now essentially what this is working as is a compound collider, so essentially just two colliding shapes that fit together to create one single rigid body object. So the rigid body itself handles the physics. Here we've got one on the left hand side and one on the right hand side, whereas here we've got one rigid body altogether. And obviously that means there's only one moving object, so it's literally physically impossible for them to split or wobble relative to each other. So here if I push down, you can see absolutely nothing happens. They never split because it's physically impossible for them to do so. Here obviously if I do that, you can see a lot of wobble. But that of course creates a problem, and there's a reason we don't generally do that, is because obviously it then acts as a single object. So if you think over in something like what's it called, Garry's Mod. So if you were playing Garry's Mod right now and you take a bunch of pieces and then you sort of weld them all together, you get something like this, where the heavy object can, lift everything, but the light object, let's say you had a wheel underneath your heavy object, always has this sort of sagging behavior. It just sort of wobbles a little bit and it's a little bit too light on the object. And that's what I wanted to try and sort of solve here. Now obviously if you did this normally, your left object here would have a center of mass here in the center, and your right object here would have a center of mass here in the center, and then obviously when they're connected, the heavier one will generally move the center of mass all the way towards itself. So what you end up with is when you balance it, you get this sort of, most of your weight is here on the left hand side, because obviously we've got 4000 kg here and 50 kg here on the right. So most of your weight is on the left hand side. That's not going to happen when you lift something that is all one piece. Your center of mass will just be wherever the heck it wants to be. In our case, it will always be in the center by default, unless you move it. And that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm actually calculating when I create the joint between them, which in actual fact is not a joint, it's just a single piece. When I create that object, I'm actually doing the calculations to position the center of mass appropriately based on what the mass would have actually been. So here we've got a mass of 4000 plus 50, so the overall object is 4050 kg, except most of that is on the left hand side, so it balances here on the left. The same thing here, the overall object is 4050 kg, there's no separate objects themselves, and it still balances in exactly the same spot. If I could position it correctly. Let me do some flying. So yeah, I've gone with the standard Garry's Mod controls here, and you'll see here that we do balance at basically the same spot. So here we've got basically the same, physics. They both react and move the way that they should as a fixed jointed object. Same with this, same with this. Except this one is obviously very wobbly, whereas this one, completely rigid. And what I wanted to do here essentially is fix that problem of having those wobbly joints in everything that we play. It reacts and interacts the way that separate objects would do. So obviously everything, including the center of mass, just reacts as if you've got two pieces, two rigid bodies, but it's only one rigid body. And we can actually tell that when we switch over to our side here. So I've got a little control that allows me to just switch on and off the mouse, so I can still move it while you know, holding the mouse. So you can see here on the left hand side, I'm going to switch to the scene view here. If I select the red box here on the left one, so this is the connected ones, these are the physics, the actual fixed jointed ones. On my right hand side here, you can see the mass is 50 kg, and then of course if you look at the blue one, you can see the mass is 4000 kg, but they are still two separate objects, completely separate. Whereas here on the right, we've got two objects, but you can see they don't have rigid bodies. That's because overall, they have one connected rigid body that holds them both at 4050 kg. But what you'll notice is, if I keep the mouse following the object, watch what happens when I stop the game. Look here on the right hand side. We don't actually have a rigid body that holds them both. That is being created at runtime. So if we look at the actual separate objects now, we can see that both the blue boxes have a 4000 kg weight. Both the red boxes have 50 kg. So these are actually two separate rigid bodies being generated, actually two separate rigid bodies, and then it generates one overall piece using my little clever script here, which is the compound body. So this is basically what this video is about, creating a compound body to prevent all of the wobbliness. For example, here I've been watching a lot of Hat films recently, and they've been playing Trailmakers. So if you have a look in Trailmakers, and if you play that game, because I played a little bit of it, you'll see that whenever you take a bunch of objects and you put them all together and you put loads of objects together, because it's one of those vehicle building games, you end up with a lot of wobbly physics, and honestly that game has some really dodgy wheel physics as a result, because there's so many pieces being fixed jointed together. This would really help. And you can see once I press play, and if we look on the right hand side here, once I press play, you get that rigid body that is added together. You've got 4050 kg added together. It works as if it's an actual connected body, and you can see every time I pick it up, you can see the configurable joint being generated. That's my joint for actually picking it up. That's how I'm picking it. That's why it's so wobbly as well. And the same thing obviously with this one, except it doesn't have the wobble. Now literally all you'd have to do for it to function correctly is just save the previous rigid bodies. So for example, the fizzbox left here, the blue one, you'd have to store the values like the current drag that it had or the mass that it had before it got created as a compound body, and then when you disconnect them, you'd be able to disconnect them properly and they would fall to pieces like they should, like any other fixed joint would. And that's basically what I wanted to show. So something like this, if I had 100 objects all put together, you wouldn't have to have millions of fixed joints connecting them all together like you do whenever you watch someone playing Garry's Mod, Garry's Mod Sandbox, or if you play it yourself. When you try and put things together, you always end up having to make a weld between these objects and then a weld between another object and this piece and this piece and this piece, and you try and put a seat on top, you have to weld it to this one and the front of your car and everything. Otherwise when you lift it, it all wobbles all over the place. This fixes that. Having a compound body instead of having fixed joints solves a lot of problems and prevents a lot of stability issues with having things like this. And you can imagine if I move it so quickly, you get a load of wobble, whereas in reality a welded object, no matter how light one piece is, sure, that piece might break eventually, but this is basically what it'll move like instead. And that pretty much solves this whole that ends this video itself. So let's just fly off, grab our little test ball here. This was the one that I was using to test the the grabby joint, and fly off into the yonder. That is the end of this video. Goodbye.